So today we're going to learn how we can set up authentication using an AdonisJS API and a Nuxt 3 front end using server-side rendering. To save us some time, I have a default project set up as a starter point for us that has Lucid installed on our AdonisJS API and Forms and it's kind of stubbed on our Nuxt 3 front end. I also have Nuxt UI installed to make the front end just a little bit more cleaner by having pre-made components ready for us. So we don't have a whole lot going on here. We have two different pages. We have a home page, which we're looking at, the test page. Both look the same. They just tell us whether or not we are logged in, which currently we are not. Then we have a sign up page and a sign in page. So let's jump into our code base. So I have both projects in a single repository. We have our backend AdonisJS API and our front end Nuxt 3 project. The left terminal that I have going down here is our AdonisJS API and the right one is our Nuxt client. And a good starting point for us is to get the auth package installed. So I'm going to do npm I at AdonisJS auth. All right, let's go ahead and configure that. So node ace configure at AdonisJS auth. We'll be selecting Lucid. Now, whenever it comes to our auth guard, I want to make an important distinction. So we're going to be using the web session-based authentication guard instead of the API token guard. The API token guard would use opaque tokens, but since our Nuxt 3 application is going to be hosted up on the web as well, and we can do both applications on the same top-level domain, we have no reason not to use sessions for this to make things nice and simple for ourselves. And this is true whether or not we're working with an SPA or a SSR application. So we can go ahead and select web here and move on. Our model name will be user, and let's have it go ahead and create a migration for us. Now, whenever I set this project up and AdonisJS asks me which project template I wanted to use, I select API. API project template does not come with session pre-installed, so let's go ahead and install that here. That's just npm I at AdonisJS session, and let's go ahead and configure it. So node ace configure AdonisJS session. Go ahead and select in the terminal here, and this is just going to give us back an env.ts declaration that we can go ahead and plop inside of our env.ts file right there, just like so. And while we're within our project, let's go ahead and dive into our start directory underneath the kernel. Whenever we configured the auth package, we got a couple new middleware added to our project, Auth and Silent Auth. I'm a fan of using the Silent Auth middleware to authenticate each request rather than doing it manually. So let's go ahead and add that into our project here. It'll be app middleware Silent Auth. Then let's jump into our config and our CORS config. We're going to want to make sure that CORS is enabled in order for our Nuxt API request to succeed properly. So let's go ahead and change that from false to true. And then lastly, let's go ahead and migrate that new users migration that we have waiting for us. So let's do node ace migration run. All right, so once that succeeds, we should be done configuring our AdonisJS API. So we can go ahead and do npm run dev there to boot back up our server. And let's collapse that back away and head into our routes file. This is where I have all of the routes defined and being handled currently. All of our auth-based routes are just currently sending back a not implemented exception. It's going to be our job to fix that and actually implement these. So in order for us to be able to turn back an auth user or sign in, we're going to need to first sign up a user. So let's go and get rid of the not implemented exception on our sign up function. Grab auth out of our HTTP context. We already have our validated data being plopped back here. So we can go ahead and do const user equals await user create provided in that data. And then all that we need to do is await auth login that user. So nothing special going on that front. For our sign-in functionality, it's going to be relatively similar. Pluck auth out of our HTTP context. Instead of needing all of our data, all that we need is UID, password, and whether or not we want the session to be remembered. So we'll want to wrap this up inside of a try catch statement. We won't be using error, so I'm going to prefix that with an underscore. And if it does error out, let's just return response, set the status to 400, and then provide ourselves back a JSON message of email or password is incorrect. Inside of our try statement here, all that we need to do is await auth attempt, provide it the UID, the password, and the remember me flag. Next, for our auth, all that we need to do is return back whether or not we have an authenticated user. This is going to serve as kind of like the auth check and simultaneously just provide back any authenticated user that we have. So we'll get auth out of our HTTP context, and here we can just return auth user. If the user is not authenticated, this won't return back anything. And if they are authenticated, it'll be our user's details. Lastly, down at the bottom, we have our sign out functionality. Just like everything else, let's pluck auth out of our HTTP context and await auth log out. So there's nothing different with authentication on this front. We're just behaving as though it's a traditional monolith besides how we're returning back our responses. All of these are returning back as JSON responses. So let's go ahead and collapse down our backend and start focusing on our front end. So first and foremost, we're going to want to set up an environment variable so that we can have access to what our API URL is, depending on what environment we're in, because whenever we're on our local host locally here on our computer, It's going to be localhost or 127.0.0.1 or whatever domain you might be working with locally. And then whenever you push this out to production or staging environment, it's going to be whatever that production or staging environment URL is. So for starters, within our front end directory, let's create a new file called .env. Nuxt does have some personal namespacing going on within the environment variables here to determine whether or not the environment variable itself is a public or private one. Private being something secret that you don't want to have publicly accessible within your rendered out script files. Public being something that doesn't really need to be a secret at all, which in terms of our API URL would be that because they're going to be accessible via the network request panel anyway. So we can Nuxt public API equals HTTP localhost 3333 or whatever port your server is running at. The Nuxt public portion here is the namespacing. So this is going to designate this API variable as a public variable. Next, let's go ahead and create ourselves a global accessor to make accessing this environment variable just a little bit more convenient. So within our front end directory, let's go ahead and create a new file within a directory called plugins, and we'll call this env.ts. This will export default define Nuxt plugin. This takes a callback function. We can grab our environment variable configuration by doing const config equals use runtime config, and then return back a provide declaration with API inside of it. This will be a function that accepts in a string path, and all that we're going to do is concatenate config.public.api plus whatever path we provide. Essentially, this plugin is providing us a helper that is globally defined within our Nuxt project. We'll be able to access this via const. Nuxt is going to prefix this with a $, API equals use Nuxt app. Just like this, we're going to be able to access this function anywhere within our Nuxt project using this line right here. Cool. So since form submissions are initiated on the client side of Nuxt instead of the server, they're rather straightforward whenever it comes to our form data. They're going to automatically pass along our session cookies so that the server automatically knows who sent that request. Let's go ahead and start by setting up our sign-in form. So we have within our pages, auth, a sign up page right here. Just like where routes were, this is currently just throwing a not implemented error, but everything else is pretty much set up. We already have our form here with our components and our buttons, and we have our form set up. I'm using one of the form utilities that I like to use. You can find that within the utilities directory if you're interested in what that's doing. But for the most part, that's going to allow us to kick off our form request by doing await form, reach inside of it because it's reactive, adds value, and then send off a post request for that. Now here we need to access our API URL, and that's where we can use that API utility that we just created, use Nuxt App, just like so. So within our post method here, we can do API and provide in our path, and our route is defined at auth sign up. And this form utility will automatically bind the form data that we have whenever it sends this request off. In terms of our sign-in page, it's going to be very much the same. We just need to grab that API. So const API equals use Nuxt app, jump down to our sign-in, await form value post API auth sign in. Cool. So now before we actually test our sign-up form, we're going to need to reboot our Nuxt server, and that's because we added environment variables and it doesn't quite pick up that change. So we'll run npm run dev there to get that booted back up. Next, let's go and jump into our browser. It's going to take a second to boot up there. There it is. All right, so let's go into our sign up. Looks like it pre-populated it with what I was testing with earlier. I'm going to go ahead and hit sign up here. Cool. We got our little thanks for joining message right down here, but currently our homepage appears as though we are not logged in, but we're not really doing anything to actually fetch that user, and we're not returning that user back whenever we finish signing up in the first place. So within our homepage here, let's go back into our index.view. We have another not implemented exception on our logout. We'll take care of that here in a second, but for our actual user grab, we're just setting it at the null. So we need to actually fetch this from our auth endpoint on our API. So for this, we can get rid of user and do const data, define this variable name as user equals await use fetch. We're going to need to grab our API utility. So const API equals use Nuxt app API and send that out to /auth. And we're also going to want to tell it to include the credentials. So within the configuration for this, we'll do credentials and set that to include. And before we take a look at what's going on here, let's copy these two lines and paste them into our test page since that's very much just the same. We'll paste that in there just like so. All right, cool. So let's jump back into our browser and take a look at what's going on. You can see we're now logged in as test@test.com, which is the user that we signed up with. If we traverse between our test and our home page, we appear to be logged in on both. If we take a look at our network request, we have our auth being kicked off, and we get back our user just like so. And this is all working perfectly fine, just natively using sessions. By providing credentials include, our API request knows that within the headers, it's going to want to include our cookie information. So right here underneath our request, if I can get the scroll to go up just a little bit more, it doesn't want to go. There it goes. We can see our cookies right here. And if we were to leave this credentials include off of this request, we're within our home page here. So if we go back to our home page, we got this one additional request going off. If we scroll down to our request headers, you can see there's not that information being included. So therefore our endpoint doesn't know who we are. Thus we appear logged out. So that line there is very important. So let's put that back. There we are. We're logged back in. Now, we're not quite done yet. You might think, okay, cool, everything's working, but go ahead and give your page a refresh. We're not logged in anymore, or at least in the eyes of our front end. And that's because this request is now sending off on the server side. And the issue there is that we're having server to server communication. Our Nuxt server is sending off the request to our AdonisJS API server. Natively, there's real no way to tell that Nuxt server to include our cookie information whenever it sends that request to our AdonisJS API. Therefore, our AdonisJS API has no clue who's making that request. Thankfully, Nuxt has a way to help make this super streamlined. So if we dive from fetch XHR here over to all, and we scroll all the way up in our request, we should have this localhost based document type request. If we take a look at the request headers here, we have our cookie information being sent. Regardless of what front-end based environment you're working with that has server-side rendering, you'll need to pluck this cookie information from your localhost document request and forward that along to any API requests you're making from that server to your API server. So for this, the Nuxt utility that makes this super easy for us is the use request headers. And so here we can just do const headers equals use request headers, designate that out of those headers, we want the cookie information. And then inside of our request itself, we just need to provide those headers. And let's go ahead and console.log out what those headers are. So give that a save. And I'm going to bump up our terminal here again so that we can actually see the server sent console log. So we only added that on our welcome page. So let's send it off to our test page and then go back to home. This request that we just made, since we're traversing through Nuxt links, is going to be sent on the client. So we can check out our console here. And you can see it right here. It's an empty object because this utility is going to pluck it off of the document-based request on the server side, not on the client side. So that is anticipated. However, we still appear logged in because we have our credentials include being specified within the configuration still. So the browser is still going to do its thing there. If, however, we give this page a full refresh, now it's sent on the server side. So let's take a look within our terminal and you'll see now we have our headers here sent with our cookie information. And essentially we're just taking this headers object with our cookie information in it and sending it along with the use fetch request that's being sent off of our Nuxt server to our AdonisJS API. Therefore, on the Adonis side, we now appear logged in and we get that user successfully being fetched from our Nuxt server. All right, cool. So that's really the difficult part of this flow to wrap your head around. Let's go ahead and round out this lesson by completing our logout functionality. I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of that console log there. And in terms of our logout functionality, all that we need is await, logout form, value, post, API, auth, sign out. We can go ahead and copy that because we have this on our test page here as well and paste that in there, give that a save. Now we should be able to go ahead and log out. There we go. We are logged out. We can verify that by refreshing. Still logged out. We should be able to go ahead and sign in now. And there we are. We are signed back in. We now have our user here still. We can traverse. We can refresh. We're still authenticated. And there you go. So the main thing to remember here is that whenever you're sending off your API request, you want to make sure that you're getting your cookies passed along to your AdonisJS API. If you leave those cookies off on your Nuxt.js server side, as we have with our test page here, you're not going to be able to fetch your user. You're not going to be able to pass or appear authenticated in the eyes of your AdonisJS API. But the second that you include that cookie information, you're good to go. Credentials include is how you provide that cookie information using the fetch API on the client side, and then plucking the cookie information off of your document's request headers and forwarding along with your API request itself is how you do it on the server side for your Nuxt server. This premise can be used for Next.js as well.